Let's now discuss the value of the pieces that will help us decide which trades are good or bad for us in a given situation. We will be wanting to trade our pieces of less value for the opponent's pieces of more value. And even though, of course, it's a situational topic, so in different positions, different pieces will have different values, it's still possible to make some general assessments of, on average, which pieces are better and which pieces are worse. So obviously, unless we are near a promotion, we can say that the pawn is the weakest because it can only move in a limited amount of ways. Only one or two moves are available every time. So we can say that it's not a very important piece in comparison, with example, with the queen that can move to a ton of different squares in almost any situation. The queen is obviously stronger than the rook and the bishop because she has those two abilities combined. And it's also stronger than the knight because even though the knight can jump, it doesn't have the mobility the queen has. So in almost every situation, a queen will be the strongest piece. And we won't be considering, of course, the king because since we are thinking of trades right now, we will never be trading a king because if we lost our king, then the game would be over. So it doesn't really make much sense to talk about the value of the king in this way, unless you want to say it's infinite value. But okay, what about the rest of the pieces? We have the rook, the bishop, and the knight. What happens with them? What's the relative strength of those three? And you could think that a bishop should be about as strong as a rook, because after all, it's the same movement but rotated, right? Still, there are some important differences that make the rook a stronger piece. For instance, here we see this bishop on the center on the board. It's a pretty strong piece. It has two long diagonals to move. Sorry about that. Let's place them here and here. So you have a lot of mobility, just as good as a rook. A rook would also have two long either columns or files to move on. But you can see that if we think of this bishop here near the corner, things are different because we still have a long diagonal to move, but also a shorter, more limited one. So this is a disadvantage, that the bishop loses mobility as it moves toward the edge of the board. Meanwhile, a rook like this one always has potentially 14 squares to go to, even if it's on the corner. It doesn't really matter. And there's also another major disadvantage of the bishop, and it's the following. This bishop is now on a dark square, and he will only ever be able to visit dark squares. Similarly, this bishop is on a light square. It will never be able to leave the light squares. So each bishop can only go to half of the board. Meanwhile, the rook doesn't have that limitation. The rook can go wherever it wants. In fact, on an empty board, it will be able to reach any square in just two moves. Meanwhile, the bishops are restricted to only half the board. So this leaves only one question left, and that is what happens with the knight, since we have queen stronger than rook, stronger than bishop, and stronger than pawn. Where does the knight lie in this scale? So I would say this position is pretty balanced, and in fact, that's why I added the pawns and the kings. So if you are doing this with a partner, try out to play this position, and maybe you can then try with a rook instead of a knight or the bishop, or with a queen to see the difference. Because you will see that this is pretty balanced. So the strength of a bishop and a knight are compensated. And in fact, when to trade a bishop for a knight is one of the toughest strategic questions in chess. And indeed, if we go to this example, this is a famous opening position that we encounter in what's called the Ruy Lopez opening, very popular. Let's play the moves from the beginning so you can see. this would be how we reach the position. So white opens up with the king's pawn, and black does the same. Now white brings the knight into the game. Notice attacking the black pawn on the center. And so black moves his knight, protecting the pawn. Now we take out the bishop, trying to attack the knight. And black decides to threaten the bishop with the pawn. So now if white does nothing, black just takes the bishop for free. And it's good evidence of the balance between bishop and knight, the fact that here, among grandmaster games, you will see two moves. So you will see either bringing the bishop back, preserving the bishop on the board, and you will also see just taking the knight, so trading the bishop for a knight. And both moves are popular, which means that neither of them is a bad move. So this means if a bishop was really so much stronger than a knight, then nobody would take the knight. And if it was so much weaker, then everyone would take it. And you see this balance that different players prefer to either take or not take. So it's complicated. In conclusion, we can say that a queen is stronger, and we usually assign it a numerical value of 9 pawns. So the pawn would be 1 and the queen would be 9. A rook would be 5, and bishop and knight would be 3 pawns worth, so equal value. But of course, this scale has a lot of caveats, and it shouldn't be treated as gospel or anything. It's just a quick reference to have a starting point. For example, you will usually see that sometimes a queen, even though it's worth 9, is stronger than 2 rooks, which are worth 5 plus 5, so 10. And when we have like a bishop or a knight and some pawns against a rook, it's also a complicated situation. So yeah, take this scale I just told you. So pawn 1, rook, bishop and knight 3, rook 5, and queen 9 as a starting point of reference, but with a lot of exceptions and variations depending on which position we are. So now we know in simple situations, when it's just one of our own pieces and one piece of our opponent that are involved, we know when to trade and when not to trade, or we have a rough guideline of when to do it. But sometimes it's complicated because we have to consider a long sequence of trades involving several pieces making several moves. So we have to account for the different attackers and defenders. In this situation, it's white to move, and you see that the queen and the rook are attacking each other. It goes both ways. So we have to take a decision. Should we capture the rook, or should we move our queen away? And at first glance, you can think, okay, if I take the rook, then my opponent will take back, and I will have lost a queen. So queen takes rook, and then queen takes queen after we've taken, and we are losing. But if you go a bit deeper, you will see that we also have a rook here. So after our opponent recaptures our queen, we can bring our rook all the way to the end of the board and also capture. And this is the type of thing you have to be thinking when having this position on the board in a real game. We have this sequence of forced moves. They aren't as forced as checks, but captures are the second most forcing type of move. So we have to try to see until the ultimate consequences of our moves. So now that we've seen that we can take and they can take and we can take back, we can also see that it doesn't really end there, because then this rook would also participate. So we have to do it even longer. So I will now ask you, what do you think? Do we end up winning, losing, or just making an equal sort of fair trade in the end? What do you think? All right, so now that you've thought about it, of course, pause the video if you need more time. We will play out the moves, see that they are all more or less forced, and see the outcome. White does indeed end with an extra rook after the trades. So first we take, and well, if black doesn't take, then we've just won a rook. So it's a favorable exchange. We haven't exchanged anything, we just taken a free rook. So the only challenging move would be for black to take our queen. And now we take with our rook. You see that we are 2 rooks for 1 left on the board right now. And as we were talking before, now this rook can take. And finally, our own rook can do the last capture. And we end up with just 1 rook for us on the board and nothing but the king and a few pawns for our opponent. So we've really taken an advantage here. We're also giving check, but it's not checkmate because the king can just move. But of course, we can't just play the move and hope it will work. We need to be able to see from the beginning and judge whether the trade is good or whether we should go for something else instead. So that's what we need to try to see all of these force moves. Since there aren't that many options, it's pretty easy, but sometimes it will get complicated. As a rule of thumb, we can say that we need to have more attackers than defenders. So here we have 3 potential attackers with the queen, the rook, and the other rook, and only 2 defenders with the queen and the rook. So that's why we end up winning in this trade. Still, sometimes it's not that easy, and let's see the following example where we will see that. So here we see that there are a lot of different pieces attacking and defending this target pawn over here. And I want you to pause for a bit and try to find out if white can take the pawn or not. Okay, this has been really a rough one because there are just so many attackers and so many defenders. So we have the pawn, another pawn, the knight, potentially the bishop once this pawn has taken, this pawn in the center. We have the rook, and after the rook takes, we will also have the queen. So 6 potential attackers. And on the other hand, we have 6 potential defenders. So with pawn, the knight, bishop, a queen, and a rook. Still, we can't just trade in any order. We have to be careful because maybe at some point our opponent just decides to stop trading. Let's see what I mean. Let's say we start by taking with the rook, even though we have other options. Let's start by taking with the rook, and our opponent just takes back, and we take with the queen, and they take back, and we take back. Yeah, we've gone the pawn, but we've lost a queen and a rook, and our opponent has only lost 2 pawns and a knight, so it's 2 pieces for 3, but the pieces we gave up were much better, much stronger than our opponents. And yeah, now if black went all the way and continued trading, then yes, of course, we would end up winning some material, but and in this point, for example here, black can say, okay, I don't want to trade anymore. I will play something else and keep my queen and my rook and my bishop intact. So let's go back to the beginning. How should we actually have played this? So we should first take or with the pawn, because now we are a pawn up, and black takes back to regain our pawn. And so we take again with a pawn. So we are again with one pawn, and black tries to take it back. Of course, they really shouldn't, but if they don't, we've already gotten an advantage. So it's okay if the trading stops here, because we have 1 pawn more than when we started. So Let's say black, for whatever reason, decides to continue to trade. Now we take again. And black takes, we still take. If black insists in taking, we take again. And you see that in every step after each of our moves, we always have extra material. Like now we have an extra rook, if you count them. One move before we had an extra bishop, and one move before we had an extra knight. So we are always gaining something if the trade continues. If black insists on still trading, then now we're up a queen. So you can see that the more trades are done, the more advantage we have. So we are basically forcing black to stop trading at some point. And of course, if they stop at a sensible moment, like it could be, for example, here, then you see that we've taken 2 enemy pawns for only one of ours. So we are always winning. And yes, you may have noticed that we've started taking with our less valuable pieces, and then we went with the more valuable ones. So we start with the pawns, then the minor pieces, which would be the bishop and the knight, and then the rook, and finally the queen. So usually this is the way to proceed. It doesn't mean always, but as a general rule, you should start your trades with your pawns and then the lower value pieces and only the higher value pieces at last. This doesn't mean it will always work like that. There will be exceptions, and we need to think of the specific position we have. But as a starting point, the first move we have to consider is, okay, I'm going to take with this pawn, or I'm going to take with this pawn. And then if we see that those don't work, or if we want to find something better, then we can think of other moves. But first we have to intuitively assess or make an educated guess that the best moves will probably be taking with, in this case, with the pawns or with the lower value pieces we have. All right, so that's going to be it for this chapter. There will also be exercises, just as we had with mate Xing1 and hanging pieces. But I also want you to play some games and think of these types of situations, maybe not as complicated as this example, but when there are multiple trades available. So be careful with those, and then after the game you can analyze it and go back and see if you did the right thing or if there was something better to do. Because yeah, at beginner level, with this and with hanging pieces, that's how most games will be decided. So that's the moments we have to focus our attention on, so to master those situations until we can move on to something more complicated.